Thank you everyone for spending the time with us to learn a bit more about the disparity study and the results of the study and some of its implications. We want to make sure that we not only provide information about the disparity study here tonight, but also give you a chance to ask any questions that you might have about results and implications. And then we're going to obviously answer all those questions. You can submit those questions either in writing in the chat or after the presentation and after we've gone through any questions that we see in the chat, we'll also answer any verbal questions as well. So to start, what is a disparity study? So disparity studies are really designed to assess outcomes for disadvantaged businesses or businesses that are presumed to be disadvantaged as part of an organization's contracting and procurement. So specifically, we look at the degree to which those businesses participate in an organization's contracts relative to their availability for that work, and then identify whether any disparities or differences exist between actual participation and estimated availability. And that information helps an organization like DC government develop programs or policies that might better encourage the participation of disadvantaged businesses, in this case, businesses owned by people of color and women, participate in their contracts and procurements. The studies typically take somewhere between 1 and 2 years to conduct, and that's in line with studies that we've conducted across the country. And recent disparity studies include studies both nationally and in the region, like the city of Boston, the Commonwealth of Virginia, the state of Maryland, and a variety of other organizations as well. And as a reminder, if you could please go ahead and mute your line until the Q&A portion of the presentation, that'd be really helpful so everyone can hear what I have to say about the disparity study. Disparity studies themselves are made up of a large collection of quantitative and qualitative research tasks. We're going to focus in on what we really consider the core of the disparity study, which is the utilization analysis, which is analysis that calculates the percentage of contracted procurement dollars that actually went to person of color and woman-owned businesses during some study period. And the availability analysis, which is the percentage of contract and procurement dollars one might expect those businesses to receive from the organization based on their existence in the marketplace and the different types of contracts and procurements they work on, their interest in working in the government sector, and a variety of other factors as well. And then finally, the disparity calculation, which is essentially comparing actual participation from the utilization analysis to estimated availability that comes out of the availability analysis. One of the primary reasons why disparity studies are important is because they provide a great deal of information that allows a program, an organization to develop programs that are not only effective, but also meet legal requirements around affirmative action in contracting. The legal requirements for disparity studies fall out of originally a case that went in front of the United States Supreme Court, the City of Richmond versus J.A. Croson, which established the strict scrutiny standard as the appropriate standard to assess the constitutionality of race-based programs and often gender-based programs as well. There are two components of strict scrutiny that are most relevant, or two components of strict scrutiny, both of which are relevant to disparity study results. One is establishing a compelling governmental interest. In other words, an organization like DC government has to have evidence of barriers and discrimination existing within their marketplace to justify the development of a race-based program. And then the second component is narrow tailoring. So DC government, in using any race-based programs, must demonstrate that their use of race-based measures are narrowly tailored to the objectives of that program. And that has a number of factors that we can talk about as the presentation goes on and as part of your questions. So the district commissioned a joint venture made up of 3 firms to conduct its disparity study. That is BBC Research and Consulting, which is a national economic and diversity research firm. We're based in Denver, Colorado, but have conducted disparity studies across the country for the past more than 30 years. For a variety of organizations, including cities, states, transportation agencies, and other government entities. It also includes Pantera Management Group, which is a Black American CB certified professional services firm based in DC. Pantera specializes in contract compliance, prevailing wage compliance, business inclusion, and POC and woman-owned business program development. And then our third partner in our joint venture is Tiber Hudson, which is a full-service law firm, also CB certified, based in DC. And Tiber Hudson specializes in legal work around government contracting, business certification, as well as public-private partnerships, corporate governance, and a variety of other related areas as well. And we also have Rob Summers from Pantera Management Group joining us here today, as well as Malik Edwards from Tiber Hudson. The 3 of us worked very closely together to conduct the disparity study, along with Stephanie Ayers, who is a senior BBC associate and served as the assistant project manager on the project as well. The overarching goal for DC government's disparity study was to assess whether any disparities exist between the actual participation and availability of POC and woman-owned businesses as part of DC contracting and procurement. So we assessed work that DC government awarded between October 1st, 2016 and September 30th, 2020. And the core analyses, as I mentioned already, were designed to assess the degree to which POC and women-owned businesses participated in DC government work during the study period and their availability for that work, and assessed whether any differences exist between those measures. So before we get into some of the details, I do want to, at a high level, go over key takeaways from the study. First, once we measured actual participation and availability, what we found was that the availability and participation of POC and women-owned businesses in DC government work was remarkably high compared to other cities and states, and we'll show some comparisons in just a couple of minutes. And although a high volume of contracting dollars were awarded to POC and women-owned businesses during the study period, the majority of those dollars were actually concentrated with a relatively small number of POC and women-owned businesses, which have important implications for disparity study results, which we'll discuss in just a couple of minutes. The disparity study team, given that level of concentration, used best practices in statistics and social science to adjust for outliers that we identified as part of the disparity study process in order to accurately represent the outcomes for most POC and women-owned businesses that exist in the marketplace. In total, study results showed substantial disparities between participation and availability for all relevant racial, ethnic, and gender groups under different circumstances, and we will review those results in just a couple of minutes as well. And really, the key takeaway from all of this is that results from the disparity study show that not only are there opportunities to enhance race and gender neutral programs that DC government might use to encourage the participation of POC and women-owned businesses in its work, but importantly, there is evidence that DC government could consider the use of race and gender conscious programs as part of its contracting and procurement processes as well. So just some characteristics of the data that we looked at as part of the disparity study. So we worked really closely with DC government to collect information on prime contracts and subcontracts that the agency awarded during our study period, which was October 1st, 2016 through September 30th, 2020. In total, there were 88 agencies that were represented as part of the disparity study, and that includes two independent agencies, Events DC and the University of the District of Columbia, which we include as part of the disparity study as well. And that in total, they represented nearly $8 billion of contract and procurements that we analyzed as part of their contracting and procurement processes. Our presentation today is going to focus exclusively on results for DC government in particular, but I would encourage you to take a look at the disparity study report, where we also discuss results for Events DC and the University of the District of Columbia separately. But today we want to focus on the core disparity study results for DC government and the agencies that fall under DC government's authority in terms of contracting and procurement. So in addition to the data we collected directly from each participating organization, there was also a great deal of information that we collected directly from businesses that exist in the marketplace, both those businesses that have done work for DC government and those businesses that might be potentially available for that work that haven't been successful in winning it. So we conducted surveys with more than 1,000 businesses as part of both the availability analysis and the utilization analysis. We sat down and conducted in-depth interviews with 40 business owners throughout the marketplace, and we have more than 100 hours of recorded evidence and testimony that provided a wealth of anecdotal evidence as part of the process. And then we also conducted public forums at the beginning of the process when we initiated the project, so that we could provide information about the disparity study, answer questions, and also collect any anecdotal evidence and insights that folks wanted to share about their experiences working in the marketplace. So all of our analyses are tailored specifically to what's called the relevant geographic market area. That is the geographic area that represents where prime contractors and subcontractors come from to actually perform on DC government projects. So we used a data-based approach to identify the relevant geographic market area for the study, which is consistent with industry best practices and relevant case law related to disparity studies. And what we found was that more than 90% of DC government, Events DC, and the University of DC's contracting and procurement dollars go to businesses that are either located in Washington, DC itself, or in various counties in Northern Virginia. So our relevant geographic market area for the study included Washington, DC, as well as 7 counties in Northern Virginia to make up, again, 92% of the dollars and the vast majority of DC government's spend, contracting and procurement spend during the study period. So the availability analysis, the utilization analysis, our analyses of conditions in the local marketplace, all of those were tailored specifically to that market area. So our first core analysis as part of the disparity study was the availability analysis. So we went out into the field and conducted surveys with businesses that are located in the relevant geographic market area and who do work that's relevant to how DC government spends contracting and procurement dollars. And then we conducted analysis where we could estimate the percentage of dollars that we would expect POC and woman-owned businesses to receive based on the specific characteristics of the contracts and procurements that DC government awarded during the study period, as well as the specific characteristics of all the businesses that completed a survey with us. And what that analysis showed is that based on the availability of POC and woman-owned businesses in the marketplace, we would expect 41.4% of DC government's dollars to go to those businesses. And that availability is led by Black American-owned businesses, which accounted for 18.9% of that 41.4% figure. Asian American owned businesses, which accounted for 11.5% of those dollars, and then white woman owned businesses and Hispanic American owned businesses. Hispanic American owned businesses accounted for 5.3% of those dollars, and white woman owned businesses accounted for 4.6% of those dollars. One thing I mentioned in our key takeaway slide is that there's relatively high availability of POC and woman-owned businesses for DC government work. So this is just a listing of the most recent disparity studies that BBC has conducted. And what you'll see is that DC government, along with Events DC and the University of the District of Columbia, all show relatively high availability relative to some of the other studies and other jurisdictions for which we've recently conducted disparity studies. That includes the Commonwealth of Virginia at 32.8%, the City of San Diego, Hamilton County in Ohio, and a variety of other organizations as well. So suffice to say, there is high availability for POC and woman-owned businesses in this region compared to some other regions of the country where we worked. We also looked at the actual dollars that DC government awarded to POC and woman-owned businesses during the study period. And we looked at that both overall and also broken down by different industries and various factors. And what that analysis showed is that during the study period, $2.9 billion of the dollars that of the contract and procurement dollars that DC government awarded during the study period actually went to POC and woman-owned businesses, both as prime contractors and subcontractors. And in terms of participation, that was again led by Black American-owned businesses. So of that 37% figure, 16% went to Black American-owned businesses, another 11.5% went to Hispanic American-owned businesses, and then about 5% went to Asian American-owned businesses and white woman-owned businesses as well. And just like availability, utilization or participation is relatively high for DC government compared to some other organizations we've worked with. So DC government's 37%, Events DC was at 19.5%, and UDC was at about 69%. And that is, at least in the case of UDC and DC government, substantially higher than some of the other organizations we've recently worked with across the country, including the City of San Diego, City of Virginia Beach, City of Denver, and a variety of other organizations as well. So once we estimated availability and calculated the percentage of dollars that DC government actually awarded to POC and woman-owned businesses, we computed what are called disparity indices, where we take actual participation from the utilization analysis divided by estimated availability from the availability analysis and multiply by 100. So a disparity index of 100 indicates that actual participation is largely in line with availability. That's often called parity between utilization and availability. A disparity index of less than 100 indicates a disparity between participation and availability for a particular group, for a particular set of contracts. And then a disparity index of less than 80 indicates a substantial disparity between participation and availability. Substantial disparities are particularly instructive because they're often taken by the court as an inference of discrimination against particular business groups relative to their availability for government work. And they often serve as justification for organizations to use relatively aggressive measures to help address those disparities. So the next slide, we're going to show where we saw substantial disparities in sort of a colored coded way. So you'll see a table where disparity indices that are 100 or greater are shown in green. So those indicate parity. Disparity indices that are shown in yellow are I guess in the gray area where there is a disparity, but it doesn't fall to the level of being considered substantial. And then disparity indices of less than 80 will be shown in a red color, pink or red color here. So it shows disparity indices by group and for various contract sets that we looked at. We show or we calculated disparity indices for far more contract sets than just what's shown here, but these are kind of the primary ones. So disparity indices overall for prime contracts versus subcontracts, for construction, professional services, and non-professional services. And it's important to note that these are basically raw analyses. They haven't been adjusted in any way. They include sort of disparity indices when we include all the data unadjusted as part of our analysis. So overall, we see substantial disparities for Asian American owned businesses and Native American owned businesses. We see disparity indices or substantial disparities for various groups for prime contracts. For subcontracts, we show them for Black American owned businesses, Native American owned businesses, as well as white woman owned businesses and all POC owned businesses considered together. For construction, we see them for Asian Americans and Native Americans. For professional services, for Hispanic American owned businesses and Native American owned businesses, and for non-professional services and goods and services, we see them for almost all groups with the exception of white woman owned businesses. Now, one important aspect of the data is how it's concentrated. So one thing we're interested in looking at, as we are as part of all our disparity studies, is whether it's the case that all POC and woman-owned businesses are enjoying success equally or across the board, or whether the majority of dollars that we see going to POC and woman-owned businesses are concentrated with relatively few firms. So what we did was essentially graph the percent of all POC and woman-owned businesses. So we looked at these 471 different POC and woman-owned businesses that received dollars from DC government during the study period, and just looked at what percentage of those firms would it take to account for the percent of total dollars that went to POC and woman-owned businesses. So as an example, if you move to the right on this graph, if you get to 10%, of the POC and woman-owned businesses that received work during the study period, that 10% of businesses, when they're ordered from the largest, the business that received the most dollars to the business that received the least dollars, only 10% of the businesses accounted for 70% of all of this $2.9 billion. So what seemed to be going on here is that a relatively small number of businesses are accounting for the lion's share of the dollars that actually went to POC and woman-owned businesses during the study period. And that led us to think about whether there were any statistical outliers in the data. In other words, are there certain firms that received so much money during the study period or so little money during the study period that they are statistically different from all the other POC and woman-owned businesses? And if that's the case, in social science, you want to account for those dollars, because our interest here is describing outcomes for your typical or average POC or woman-owned business. And we wanted to account for any statistical outliers so we can get a clearer picture on what's going on, what outcomes look like for the typical POC or woman-owned business in DC government contracting. So going through and trying to identify statistical outliers, we identified 7 outliers at the top end of the scale. So there were 2 Hispanic American-owned businesses, a white woman American-owned business, 2 Black American-owned businesses, and 2 white American woman-owned businesses, and 3 Hispanic American-owned businesses, and 2 Black American-owned businesses that received so much money on contracts and procurements that DC government awarded during the study period that they were actually statistical outliers, that they were statistically different from all other POC and woman-owned businesses. And then there were 18 firms at the bottom of the scale that received so few dollars, they were also considered statistical outliers. So we went through a process where we identified those 25 statistical outliers and then adjusted the dollars they received so that they looked more like the rest of the 471 POC and woman-owned businesses that received dollars during the study period, and then recalculated disparity indices. And what we found was a set of results that looked, that identified or that revealed far more substantial disparities when you go through the results. So when you account for or adjust results for statistical outliers, what you find is overall, substantial disparities for all relevant racial, ethnic, and gender groups. Substantial disparities for all groups except for Black American-owned businesses for prime contracts, and even Black American-owned businesses showed a disparity index of 81, so they're just above that threshold for what's often considered a substantial disparity. Substantial disparities for all groups on subcontracts, with the exception of Asian American-owned businesses and Hispanic American-owned businesses. Substantial disparities for most groups in construction, for most groups in professional services, and then for all groups in non-professional services and goods and supplies. So the idea here is that when you account for these statistical outliers, what you see is when you're considering just these typical POC and woman-owned businesses, you see substantial disparities almost across the board for all groups, which is quite instructive for DC government's programs and measures moving forward in terms of what they might consider in helping address some of the barriers that exist. So just to reiterate our key takeaways, first, availability and participation of POC and women-owned businesses is remarkably high for DC government relative to other cities and states that we've recently worked with. But whereas there's a high volume of contract dollars that DC government awarded to POC and women-owned businesses during the study period, the majority of those dollars were awarded to a relatively small number of businesses. And when you take into account those businesses that are statistical outliers, you actually see substantial disparities almost across the board for all the different contract sets that we looked at and all the different racial, ethnic, and gender groups that we looked at as well. And there is a number of different data points and a lot of evidence for DC government to consider. But what the findings generally show is that there are opportunities to enhance POC and woman-owned business participation through both improvements and additional race and gender neutral measures, but that there also seems to be a good deal of evidence suggesting the use of legally defensible race and gender conscious measures, which DC government can consider moving forward. I want to pass it back to Ben now so he can talk a bit about how DC government is considering all this information and what next steps are in terms of program development and policy development.
Thanks so much, Samir. And before I do that, and this is largely going to talk about where do we go from here? Now this disparity study has been published, it's been released, the recommendations are live. What are the next steps here? But I actually, Samir, was wondering, there are a few slides in this deck that is also publicly available that show just the lists of recommendations. And I wonder if you could spend just a minute, if possible, just speaking broadly to the types of recommendations coming out of this study that the disparity study team has offered to the district to consider. And then I'm happy to jump back into the next steps. But I think that might be helpful to frame some of the discussion.
Yeah, and I think this slide kind of introduces those topics quite well. And there's a series of slides here that go through a number of our other recommendations as well. Excuse me. So first, we think it's important that DC government establish a overall POC and woman-owned business goal to help define its program and help establish aspirational objectives for various program measures that it might use to encourage participation of POC and woman-owned businesses in its work in particular. Second, we think it's important they consider the use of race and gender conscious goals, participation goals on individual contracts and procurements that are separate from CBE goals or different at least from CBE goals. But the way these goals would work is on a contract by contract basis. DC government would establish participation goals for POC and woman-owned businesses based on their availability for the types of work involved in a particular project. And those goals would be established prior to project solicitation, and prime contractors would have to meet those goals or show good faith efforts in trying to meet those goals in order for their bid or their proposals to be considered responsive. That's a race and gender conscious measure that lots of organizations across the country use, and we think that DC government should consider using them as well based on results from the disparity study. And then we also offer a number of recommendations around race and gender neutral measures that we think POC and woman-owned businesses can benefit from, but also all businesses can benefit from, because it'll make it easier to engage with DC government, especially for small businesses that are trying to compete for that work. So that includes unbundling contracts and procurements so that contract sizes on average can be smaller and more accessible to POC and woman-owned businesses and other small businesses, streamlining various procurement policies, helping to ensure that businesses are paid promptly on DC government work, so that businesses have better access to capital, and a variety of other race and gender neutral measures as well. That, again, I would encourage everyone here to sort of go through the presentation, which is publicly available, and disparity study report, just to get a bit more detail on some of our recommendations, both race and gender neutral and race and gender conscious, in terms of those POC and woman-owned business contracting goals.
Great. Thanks so much, Samir. And if you can jump back to the, yep. So I think that was really helpful, just to understand some of the recommendations coming out of the disparity study. This disparity study took about 2 years to go through, which is pretty normal for disparity studies. And phase 2, what we're calling phase 2, really starts now. And because using the data that was analyzed, using the recommendations that came out of this report, the next step here for the district is bringing together the agencies that are best placed to think through the almost 20 different recommendations coming out of this report, who are experts on the contracting side, who work with our small businesses, who are looking at the data, who are focused on racial equity, and bringing those agencies together over the course of a year to go in depth on each one of those recommendations, to understand implementation, to understand what data needs to be collected or what systems need to be put together in order to track or verify data, to understand if the district is going to pursue race and gender conscious actions, for the first time in almost 30 years, what is the best structure for that program, to work with the council and the stakeholders to understand what that program looks like, and to make sure that that is a legally defensible program in the event that those programs are challenged in court, which Samir alluded to at the beginning of this conversation, that does happen with race and gender conscious programs. We want to make sure we're putting our best foot forward there. So this is just a little bit of a snapshot of what that working group will do, the kind of action plan that we hope to develop in the next year, the folks who are going to be included on that in terms of the agency representatives from the district. We are also, as typical, leading best practice in disparity studies.
You need to catch after that.
We want to make sure that the district is going to contract another disparity study in FY 2026 that looks back, at least looking at FY 21 to 25. As a reminder, this study looked at FY 2016 to 2020. So a lot of cities and jurisdictions who have done one disparity study and taken action afterwards have committed to more recurring disparity studies at different intervals. So I'm going to stop there.